The fluorescent lights flickered in room 203 of Lincoln Middle School as Marcus Thompson slid into his usual seat in the back row. At 13, he'd mastered the art of making himself invisible, shoulders hunched, eyes down, trying his best to blend into the institutional beige walls. But no matter how hard he tried, Mrs. Reynolds always seemed to find a reason to single him out. "Mr. Thompson, late again, I see," she announced to the class, though Marcus had arrived 3 minutes before the bell. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others pretended to be suddenly fascinated by their notebooks. They'd all witnessed this dance before, the way Mrs. Reynolds would find any excuse to criticize Marcus, the only black student in her 8th grade English class. Marcus mumbled a quiet sorry and pulled out his dog-eared copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were studying a book about racial injustice while living through it in real time. His mom had taught him to hold his head high, to never let anyone make him feel less than who he was, but some days, like today, that lesson felt heavier than his backpack full of textbooks. "Since you're so fond of being the center of attention," Mrs. Reynolds said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness, "why don't you read the first passage aloud?" She knew Marcus struggled with reading in front of others, not because he couldn't read, but because his childhood stutter resurfaced when he felt pressured. The class held its collective breath. Even Lily Chen, the straightest student who usually had her hand raised before Mrs. Reynolds finished asking a question, looked down at her desk. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. But something was different today. Maybe it was the way the morning sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the classroom. Maybe it was the memory of his father's words from the night before, telling him about the struggles he faced and overcome. Or maybe, just maybe, it was time for someone to stand up to Mrs. Reynolds. What happened next would change not just Marcus's life, but the entire dynamics of Lincoln Middle School. It would spark a conversation that was long overdue in their small suburban community. Sometimes the smallest moments of courage can create the biggest ripples of change. The story of Marcus Thompson and Mrs. Reynolds isn't just about a teacher and a student. It's about power, prejudice, and the quiet strength it takes to face injustice. It's about how karma has a way of balancing the scales when we least expect it. And most importantly, it's about how one person's stand against discrimination can inspire others to find their voice. That morning in room 203 started like any other Tuesday, but it would end in a way that no one could have predicted. As Marcus took a deep breath and looked at the page in front of him, his fingers tracing the words he was about to read, he had no idea that he was about to become the catalyst for a change that would ripple through the halls of Lincoln Middle School for years to come. What makes this story unique isn't just what happened within those four walls. It's about how a community responded when faced with uncomfortable truths. It's about the unlikely allies who emerged from unexpected places, and how sometimes the most powerful lessons aren't found in textbooks, but in the moments that test our character. Mrs. Reynolds stood at the front of the class, her arms crossed, waiting. She'd been teaching at Lincoln Middle School for 27 years, and in her mind, she'd never done anything wrong. She was just maintaining standards. At least that's what she told herself, but standards, as Marcus was about to prove, shouldn't come with a side of prejudice. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. 24 faces watched as Marcus squared his shoulders, something shifting in his expression. In that moment, he wasn't just Marcus Thompson, the quiet kid from the back row. He was every student who'd ever felt belittled, every voice that had been silenced, and every dream that had been dismissed. What happened in the next few minutes would not only challenge Mrs. Reynolds' authority, but would also expose a pattern that had gone unchecked for far too long. It would force the school administration to confront uncomfortable questions about bias in their hallways. And it would remind everyone that sometimes the most powerful form of karma isn't revenge. It's justice served through truth. As Marcus opened his mouth to speak, no one could have predicted how this ordinary Tuesday would unfold. No one could have guessed that a simple English class would become a turning point in their school's history. But then again, that's how change often happens. Not with grand announcements or dramatic declarations, but with small moments of courage that spark something bigger than ourselves. This is a story about standing up to bullying and discrimination. It's about how karma works in mysterious ways, bringing truth to light when we least expect it. But most importantly, it's about how one student's courage to speak his truth would start a chain reaction that would transform not just a classroom, but an entire community's understanding of justice, equality, and the power of standing up for what's right. The events that unfolded that day in room 203 would prove that sometimes the most important lessons we learn in school have nothing to do with the curriculum. And as Marcus faced Mrs. Reynolds, neither of them knew that their confrontation would lead to revelations that would shake Lincoln Middle School to its very foundation. Marcus felt every eye in the room on him as he cleared his throat. His hands were trembling slightly, but his voice came out stronger than anyone expected, including Mrs. Reynolds. He began reading the passage about Scout's first day at school, and for the first time in room 203, his words flowed without a single stutter. "Very surprising," Mrs. Reynolds said when he finished, her lips pressed into a thin line. The surprise in her voice carried an unmistakable edge of disappointment, as if she'd been denied the satisfaction of watching him struggle. But before she could make another comment, a knock at the classroom door interrupted the tension. Principal Davis stood in the doorway, accompanied by a woman Marcus had never seen before. She carried a tablet and wore a visitor's badge, her professional attire suggesting she wasn't just another parent. "Mrs. Reynolds," Principal Davis said, his usually jovial face unexpectedly serious, "could you step outside for a moment?" As Mrs. Reynolds left the room, whispers erupted among the students. Sarah Martinez, who sat next to Marcus, leaned over and whispered, "That's Dr. Chen. She's from the District Education Board. My mom told me they're doing some kind of investigation." The class tried to eavesdrop on the conversation in the hallway, but only caught fragments of words like complaints and pattern of behavior. Through the door's window, they could see Mrs. Reynolds' face turning increasingly red as she gestured animatedly. While the drama unfolded in the hallway, Marcus's mind wandered to the events that had led to this moment. It had started 3 months ago when his family moved from Atlanta to this suburban neighborhood. His dad, a software engineer, had gotten a great job offer they couldn't refuse. "It's a good school district," his parents had said, full of hope for their new beginning. At first, the microaggressions were subtle. Mrs. Reynolds would accidentally skip over Marcus during class discussions, even when his hand was the only one raised. She'd make pointed comments about maintaining academic standards whenever he spoke up in class. When he scored high on a test, she hinted at cheating, loudly enough for everyone to hear, but carefully worded to avoid direct accusation. What Mrs. Reynolds didn't know was that Marcus had been meticulously documenting everything. In a notebook hidden in his desk at home, he'd recorded dates, times, and exact quotes. His mother, a former journalist, had taught him the importance of keeping detailed records. "Words have power," she always said, "but evidence makes them undeniable." The turning point came last week, when Marcus's English essay about civil rights received a D-, the same essay that his father's colleague, a college professor, had reviewed and praised as exceptionally well written for an 8th grader. That evening, during dinner, Marcus finally broke down and shared everything with his parents. His father's hands had gripped the dinner table so hard his knuckles turned white, but his voice remained calm. "Sometimes," he'd said, "fighting back means being smarter, not louder." That night, they drafted an email to the District Education Board, attaching Marcus's notebook entries, assignments, and recordings he'd made during class on his phone. Back in the present, the door opened, and Principal Davis stepped back into the classroom. "Class, please read Chapter 7 quietly. Mrs. Reynolds will be—" He paused, choosing his words carefully, stepping out for the remainder of the day. As Mrs. Reynolds gathered her things, her hands shaking with barely contained rage, she shot Marcus a look that mixed disbelief with something else. Fear. For the first time, she seemed to realize that the power dynamic had shifted. But this wasn't just about Marcus anymore. As Mrs. Reynolds stormed out, other students began to whisper. James Peterson, a white student who'd always been quiet, raised his hand. "Principal Davis? I have something to say about Mrs. Reynolds, too." Like a dam breaking, stories started pouring out. Lily Chen revealed how Mrs. Reynolds had mocked her accent during parent-teacher conferences. Mohammed Patel described how she'd made him feel ashamed about bringing traditional Indian lunch to school. Each story added another piece to a puzzle that painted a disturbing picture of systematic discrimination. Dr. Chen, who had slipped quietly into the classroom, was now taking rapid notes on her tablet. Her presence seemed to give students the courage to speak up, to share the stories they'd been too afraid to tell before. Principal Davis listened, his face growing more troubled with each revelation. The school had prided itself on its zero-tolerance policy for discrimination, but somehow, Mrs. Reynolds had managed to fly under the radar for years. Or perhaps, more troublingly, her behavior had been noticed but ignored. As the impromptu testimony session continued, Marcus felt a mix of emotions wash over him. There was relief that the truth was finally coming out, satisfaction that Mrs. Reynolds would face consequences for her actions, but also a gnawing anxiety about what would happen next. Would there be retaliation? Would other teachers treat him differently now? The bell rang, but nobody moved. This moment felt too important to interrupt. Dr. Chen looked up from her tablet, her expression both concerned and determined. "I want to thank you all for your courage," she said. "What happens next will depend partly on what we discover in our investigation, but I want you to know that your voices have been heard." As students finally began packing up their books, the atmosphere in room 203 had changed. Something had shifted, not just for Marcus, but for everyone. Yet even as hope filled the air, questions lingered. What would the investigation reveal? How deep did the problem really go? And most importantly, what would happen when Mrs. Reynolds inevitably returned to school the next day? The story was far from over, and the next 24 hours would prove to be even more dramatic than anyone could have anticipated. Because sometimes, when karma strikes, it doesn't just tap you on the shoulder, it shakes the very foundation of everything you thought you knew. The next morning dawned with a peculiar energy crackling through the halls of Lincoln Middle School. News had spread like wildfire about the events in room 203, morphing and growing with each retelling. As Marcus walked through the main entrance, he noticed people looking at him differently, not with pity or awkwardness, but with something that felt like respect. Mrs. Reynolds wasn't in class that morning. Instead, a substitute teacher, Ms. Garcia, stood at the front of the room. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with a warm smile that put everyone at ease. "I'll be with you for the next few weeks," she announced, letting the implications of that statement sink in. During lunch period, Marcus sat with his usual group, Sarah, Mohammed, and James. They'd grown closer since yesterday's revelations, bound together by their shared experiences. "My parents called the school board last night," James said, pushing his cafeteria pizza around his plate. "Dad was furious, said he wished he'd known sooner." "Mine too," Mohammed added. "My mom kept apologizing for not believing me when I first told her about the lunch incident. She thought I was just being sensitive." He paused, then smiled slightly. "She's making me extra samosas today, said I should be proud of our food." The conversation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor to their table, Lily Chen. Usually, she sat with the honor roll students, but today she pulled up a chair next to Marcus. "I've been doing some digging," she said, her voice low. "My sister graduated from here 3 years ago, and she said Mrs. Reynolds was the same way back then. She's been doing this for years." As they talked, Marcus noticed something else. Other teachers were watching their table, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Mr. Thompson, the science teacher, gave Marcus a supple nod as he walked past. Later, Marcus would learn that the faculty was deeply divided over the situation. Some defended Mrs. Reynolds, citing her long service to the school. Others had apparently been waiting for years for someone to finally speak up. After lunch, Marcus was called to the guidance counselor's office. Ms. Roberts, the counselor, had always been kind to him, but today she seemed different, more focused, less casual. "Marcus," she began, "I want you to know that what you did was incredibly brave, but I also want to make sure you're prepared for what might come next." She explained that Mrs. Reynolds had hired a lawyer and was claiming that she was the victim of a witch hunt. She was painting herself as a dedicated educator being persecuted by oversensitive students and paranoid parents. Some members of the school board were apparently sympathetic to her version of events. Walking back to class, Marcus felt his stomach churn. He hadn't expected this to become so complicated. In the hallway, he overheard two teachers discussing how schools these days are too soft, and he can't say anything anymore without someone crying discrimination. They fell silent when they noticed him. But for every negative reaction, there seemed to be two positive ones. Students from other classes started sharing their own stories on social media. A hashtag started trending locally. Hashtag Lincoln Speaks Up. The local newspaper had picked up the story, though they weren't naming any students to protect their privacy. During last period, an announcement came over the PA system. There would be an emergency school board meeting tomorrow night. All students, parents, and community members were invited to attend. The way Principal Davis's voice shook slightly as he made the announcement suggested that this wasn't just a routine meeting. After school, as Marcus waited for his mom to pick him up, Sarah rushed over with her phone. "You need to see this," she said breathlessly. She pulled up a Facebook post from a former student, dated 10 years ago, describing experiences with Mrs. Reynolds that eerily mirrored their own. The post was going viral, with hundreds of comments from other alumni sharing similar stories. Marcus's mom arrived, and he could tell from her expression that she'd seen the post too. "Honey," she said as he got in the car, "there's something else you should know. Mrs. Reynolds just gave an interview to Channel 5 News. She's telling a very different story." On the drive home, they listened to the radio news. Mrs. Reynolds' tearful voice filled the car. "I've dedicated my life to teaching all students. These accusations are devastating. I'm being targeted because I maintain high standards and refuse to lower them for anyone." The reporter went on to mention that similar situations were unfolding in schools across the country, raising questions about where to draw the line between maintaining academic standards and addressing systemic bias. The story was becoming bigger than just Lincoln Middle School. At home, Marcus found his inbox flooded with messages from students he'd never even spoken to, sharing their own experiences with discrimination at school, not just from Mrs. Reynolds, but from other teachers too. It was as if his actions had opened a floodgate of suppressed voices. As he sat down to do his homework, his phone buzzed with a text from Lily. "Emergency meeting at the library tomorrow before school. We found something big, really big." The message ended with a cryptic addition: "Bring your notebook. Everything's about to change." Marcus stared at the message, his heart racing. Whatever Lily had discovered, he knew tomorrow would be a turning point. But as he looked out his window at the setting sun, he couldn't shake the feeling that this story was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would force everyone at Lincoln Middle School to choose a side. Marcus arrived at the library 30 minutes before school started, clutching his notebook. The morning air was crisp, and the sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the empty school grounds. Lily was already there, along with Sarah, Mohammed, and surprisingly, half a dozen other students he didn't recognize. "Show him," Sarah whispered to Lily, who pulled out a thick manila folder from her backpack. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. "My sister didn't just remember Mrs. Reynolds," she explained. "She kept everything. Every assignment, every grade, every email, and she wasn't the only one." The folder contained a decade's worth of documentation, assignments with inconsistent grading patterns, emails showing clear bias, and most damaging of all, a series of private messages between Mrs. Reynolds and other teachers that had somehow been obtained. In these messages, she openly mocked students of color, made fun of their names, and discussed ways to maintain the school's standards by discouraging certain students from taking advanced classes. "There's more," Mohammed said, pulling out his phone. He played a recording of a conversation from 3 years ago, captured during a parent-teacher conference. Mrs. Reynolds' voice was unmistakable as she suggested to an immigrant parent that their child might be better suited for a less challenging academic environment. As they pored over the evidence, the library door opened. Principal Davis walked in, his face ashen. "I thought I might find you all here," he said quietly. "There's something you need to know. Mrs. Reynolds is holding a press conference this morning. She's bringing her lawyer and—" He paused, swallowing hard. "Several school board members who support her." The students exchanged worried glances. This was bigger than they'd anticipated. "But sir," Marcus began, "what about all this evidence? What about the investigation?" Principal Davis sat down heavily in one of the library chairs. "The investigation is being challenged. Mrs. Reynolds' lawyer is claiming it was procedurally improper. They're trying to paint this as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social media." He looked at the students with tired eyes. "They're going to try to discredit you all, especially you, Marcus." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert. Mrs. Reynolds' press conference was starting early. They huddled around the small screen, watching as she stood at a podium outside the district office, surrounded by supporters holding signs that read, "Support our teachers," and "Stop the witch hunt." For 27 years, Mrs. Reynolds began, her voice thick with emotion, "I've maintained the highest standards of education. Now, I'm being attacked by students who simply don't want to do the work required to succeed. This isn't about discrimination, it's about maintaining academic excellence." The cameras panned to show several school board members nodding in agreement. Mrs. Reynolds continued, "I have here statements from dozens of former students, all supporting my teaching methods. This entire situation has been manufactured by a small group of students who..." But before she could finish, her words were drowned out by a commotion off camera. The feed shook as the camera turned to show a large group of people approaching, students, parents, and alumni, all carrying their own signs and folders filled with papers. Marcus recognized some of the faces from the social media posts he'd seen. Former students who graduated years ago, parents who'd fought lonely battles against the system, and even a few retired teachers. They formed a silent line behind the podium, each holding up their own documentation of Mrs. Reynolds's pattern of discrimination. Back in the library, Lily's phone chimed with a message. "It's from Dr. Chen," she said, her voice shaking. "The district investigation. They found something in Mrs. Reynolds's official records. Something from her previous school, before she came to Lincoln. Something she tried to have erased." The school's first bell rang, startling them all. Students would be arriving soon, but Marcus knew that whatever happened in their classes today would be overshadowed by the drama unfolding at the district office. As they gathered their things, Principal Davis spoke again, his voice firmer now. "The school board meeting tonight will determine more than just Mrs. Reynolds's fate," he said. "It will decide what kind of school, what kind of community we want to be." He looked at each student in turn. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Marcus clutched the manila folder, thinking about all the students who'd suffered in silence over the years. About his parents' words about fighting smart, not loud. About the responsibility that came with finally having evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away. As they walked to their first class, a news van pulled into the school parking lot. More would follow. By lunchtime, the story would be on every local channel. By dinner, it would make national news. And by the time the school board meeting started that evening, Lincoln Middle School would become the center of a controversy that had been brewing for decades. The clock in the hallway ticked toward 8 a.m., each second bringing them closer to a confrontation that would change everything. Marcus took a deep breath, remembering his father's words about courage. Tonight, he would need every ounce of it. Because in just a few hours, the truth about Mrs. Reynolds, all of it, would finally come to light. And nothing at Lincoln Middle School would ever be the same again. The story was approaching its most critical moment, and as Marcus walked to class, he couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was just beginning. Whatever Dr. Chen had discovered in those old records, whatever Mrs. Reynolds was trying to hide, it would all come out tonight. The only question was, who would be left standing when the dust settled? The school day crawled by with an almost unbearable tension. During third period, Marcus's phone vibrated with a message from Dr. Chen. "Found more. Mrs. Reynolds worked at 3 schools before Lincoln. Left each one under mysterious circumstances. Meeting you and the others in the cafeteria during lunch. Bring Principal Davis." When lunchtime arrived, the cafeteria buzzed with nervous energy. Dr. Chen sat at a corner table, surrounded by stacks of papers and a laptop. Her usual professional composure seemed shaken. "What I'm about to show you," she said, glancing around to ensure no one else was within earshot, "explains why Mrs. Reynolds is fighting so hard to stop this investigation." She turned her laptop around, revealing scanned documents from 1997, Mrs. Reynolds' first teaching job in Arizona. Similar complaints had been filed there, but they'd been buried under confidential settlement agreements. She'd left that school quietly, only to repeat the pattern in Nevada, then Oregon, before finally arriving at Lincoln. "But here's where it gets worse," Dr. Chen continued, pulling out a fresh stack of papers. "We found evidence that some current board members knew about her history when they hired her. They ignored the red flags because she had a reputation for producing high test scores, no matter the human cost." Principal Davis sank into his chair, his face pale. "Some of these board members are still serving," he whispered. "This isn't just about one teacher anymore. This is about systemic failure at every level. Suddenly, Sarah burst into the cafeteria, out of breath. "You need to see this," she gasped, holding up her phone. Mrs. Reynolds was giving another interview, but this time she brought a former student with her, Thomas Walker, who graduated 5 years ago and was now a successful college student. "Mrs. Reynolds pushed me to excel," Thomas was saying on camera. "Without her tough love, I wouldn't be where I am today." What the interview didn't mention was that Thomas was from a wealthy family and had always been one of Mrs. Reynolds's favorites. But as they watched, something unexpected happened. The camera caught a group of protesters in the background, and among them was a face that made Marcus's heart stop: Thomas's younger sister, Amanda. She was holding a sign that read, "Ask him about what she did to the rest of us." The revelation sent shockwaves through the group. "Amanda Walker," Lily whispered. "She was in my sister's class. She transferred schools halfway through the year because of Mrs. Reynolds, but everyone thought it was because her family moved." Just then, Mohammed's phone lit up with a notification. Someone had created a new social media account called Lincoln Truth and was uploading dozens of screenshots, old emails, grade books, and meeting notes. The account was posting everything, naming names, including board members who had covered up complaints over the years. Principal Davis immediately got on the phone with the district office. The posts were going viral, and journalists were already calling for comments. The carefully managed narrative that Mrs. Reynolds and her supporters had built was unraveling in real time. As the lunch period ended, Dr. Chen received an urgent text. Her face went through a range of emotions as she read it. "The State Education Board just got involved," she announced. "They're sending representatives to tonight's meeting. This isn't just about Lincoln anymore. They're launching a full investigation into every school where Mrs. Reynolds taught." But the biggest shock came during last period. As Marcus sat in Ms. Garcia's class, trying to focus on To Kill a Mockingbird, the classroom door opened. A woman walked in, elderly, elegant, and vaguely familiar. It took Marcus a moment to realize why she looked familiar. She was Mrs. Reynolds' predecessor, the English teacher who had mysteriously retired 15 years ago. "My name is Mrs. Harrison," she announced to the silent class. "And I think it's finally time I told the truth about why I really left Lincoln Middle School." She looked directly at Marcus, her eyes filled with a mixture of regret and determination. "What happened to you, young man, happened because I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. But that ends today." The class sat in stunned silence as Mrs. Harrison pulled out an old leather-bound journal. "I documented everything," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Everything I saw, everything I was told to ignore. And tonight, at the board meeting, I'm going to read every single word." As the final bell rang, students rushed to spread the news about Mrs. Harrison's return. Outside, news vans lined the street, and parents were already gathering for the evening's meeting. But among the crowd, Marcus spotted something that made his blood run cold. Mrs. Reynolds herself, walking toward the school entrance with her lawyer and what appeared to be a thick folder of her own. The look in her eyes sent a clear message. She wasn't going down without a fight, and whatever was in that folder she carried might change everything they thought they knew about this story. The truth, it seemed, was about to become even more complicated than anyone had imagined. The school board meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m., but by 6:15, the auditorium was already packed. News cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like warning signals in the dimness. Marcus sat in the front row with his parents, surrounded by Lily, Sarah, Mohammed, and their families. Mrs. Harrison sat directly behind them, her leather journal placed carefully on her lap. At precisely 7 p.m., Board President Richardson called the meeting to order. The tension in the room was palpable as Mrs. Reynolds and her lawyer took their seats at a table facing the board. She still clutched that mysterious folder, her knuckles white against the manila envelope. "Before we begin," Mrs. Reynolds' lawyer announced, standing up, "my client would like to present evidence that this entire situation has been orchestrated to destroy her reputation." He began distributing copies of the folder's contents to board members. Marcus felt his heart sink as he watched the board members' expressions change while reading the documents. Mrs. Reynolds smiled slightly, the same smile she'd given him countless times in class when she thought she'd caught him doing something wrong. But then something unexpected happened. Dr. Chen stood up, holding her tablet. "Before we continue," she said, Her voice steady. "I'd like to share some relevant information that just came to light." She connected her tablet to the projector, and suddenly, the wall behind the board was filled with emails, hundreds of them. These are communications between Mrs. Reynolds and various school administrators over the past 15 years, Dr. Chen explained. They were recovered from the district's archived servers this afternoon. In them, Mrs. Reynolds openly discusses her methods for maintaining what she calls academic standards. The room fell silent as people began reading. The emails were damning. Explicit discussions about how to discourage certain students from taking advanced classes, jokes about students' names and backgrounds, and strategies for hiding complaints from parents. Mrs. Reynolds stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Those emails are taken out of context," she exclaimed. "And what about the evidence I just presented?" "You mean these doctored grade reports?" Principal Davis stepped forward, holding up the papers from her folder. "We've already verified with the district's IT department that these were altered. Did you really think we wouldn't check?" The room erupted in murmurs. Mrs. Reynolds's face turned pale, but she wasn't done fighting. "What about Thomas Walker?" she demanded. "He's proof that my methods work." "You mean my brother?" A clear voice rang out from the back of the room. Amanda Walker strode down the center aisle, her head held high. "The brother who just called me an hour ago, crying because he finally found the courage to tell the truth." She reached the front and turned to face the crowd. "Thomas lied on camera today because Mrs. Reynolds threatened to reveal that she had helped him cheat on his SATs." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Mrs. Reynolds's lawyer quickly whispered something in her ear, but she pushed him away, standing up with a look of desperation. "You don't understand," she said, her voice cracking. "I was trying to protect this school's reputation. These students, they weren't prepared for." "Stop." Mrs. Harrison's voice cut through the chaos like a steel blade. The elderly teacher walked slowly to the front, her journal open. "I watched you do this for years, Barbara. I watched and I said nothing, and that silence has haunted me every day since I left." She began reading from her journal, describing incidents from 15 years ago that perfectly matched the patterns students were reporting now. As she read, more people stood up, former students, parents, even a retired administrator, each adding their voice to the testimony. Mrs. Reynolds sank back into her chair, the fight finally draining from her face. Her lawyer quietly gathered his papers and slipped out of the room. The State Education Board representatives conferred briefly before addressing the room. "In light of this evidence, we are immediately suspending Mrs. Reynolds' teaching license, pending a full investigation. Furthermore, we will be launching a comprehensive review of hiring practices and complaint procedures across the entire district." But Marcus knew this wasn't just about one teacher losing her license. As he looked around the room, he saw something changing in people's expressions, a awakening, a recognition of how silence and complacency had allowed this situation to continue for so long. Principal Davis stepped forward one last time. "This has been a difficult lesson for all of us," he said. "But thanks to the courage of our students, particularly Marcus Thompson, we're finally learning it." He turned to face Marcus directly. "You showed us that standing up for what's right isn't just about being brave. It's about being persistent, gathering evidence, and refusing to be silenced." As the meeting concluded, reporters rushed forward with questions, but Marcus's attention was caught by something else. In the back of the room, other teachers were standing up, one by one, holding their own folders and notebooks. "We have stories too," one said, "about other schools, other districts." The story that had started in room 203 was growing, spreading beyond Lincoln Middle School, beyond their district, becoming part of a larger conversation about accountability in education. As Marcus walked out of the auditorium with his parents that night, he realized that karma hadn't just struck, it had started a revolution. 3 months later, Lincoln Middle School would become known as a model for institutional change, with new policies and procedures that would be adopted by districts across the country. And it all started because one student refused to be invisible, because he chose to stand up and speak his truth. But that's another story for another day. 6 months after that fateful board meeting, Lincoln Middle School had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The hallways buzzed with a different kind of energy now, one of openness and mutual respect. Marcus, now in his final semester of 8th grade, walked through those same corridors with his head held high, no longer trying to make himself invisible. Ms. Garcia, who had started as a substitute, was now the permanent English teacher for room 203. Under her guidance, the class discussions about To Kill a Mockingbird had taken on new meaning. Students felt free to share their perspectives, their experiences, and their truths without fear of judgment or retaliation. The changes went far beyond one classroom. Principal Davis had implemented a new anonymous reporting system, making it easier for students to speak up about any form of discrimination. Regular cultural sensitivity training became mandatory for all staff members. The school board, with several new members who had been elected after the scandal, established a diversity and inclusion committee that included students, teachers, and parents. Sarah, Lily, and Mohammed had started a student advocacy group that met weekly. What began as a small gathering in the library had grown into a powerful voice for student rights. They called themselves Room 203 Legacy, and their influence spread to other schools in the district. Mrs. Harrison became a regular visitor, mentoring students and sharing her experiences. Her journal had become required reading for new teachers in the district, a powerful reminder of the importance of speaking up. She often told Marcus, "Your courage gave me mine back." Sometimes it takes the youngest among us to show the way. The Lincoln Truth social media account evolved into a platform for positive change, sharing stories of progress and transformation from schools across the country. Amanda Walker became one of its most active contributors, working to help other students find their voice. One morning, as Marcus sat in Ms. Garcia's class, a new student walked in. Like Marcus had been months ago, she seemed nervous, trying to make herself small. But this time, the class response was different. Sarah immediately moved her backpack, making space at her table. Lily offered to share her textbook. The message was clear: at Lincoln Middle School, no one had to feel invisible anymore. During lunch that day, Marcus received an unexpected email. It was from Thomas Walker, Amanda's brother. He had finally found the courage to come clean about everything, including the Sete incident. He was working with college administrators to make things right, even if it meant risking his admission. "Your strength showed me that living with a lie is harder than facing the truth," he wrote. The state investigation into Mrs. Reynolds' past continued, revealing similar patterns at her previous schools. But more importantly, it sparked a nationwide conversation about accountability in education. Other districts began reviewing their hiring practices and complaint procedures. The ripple effect of what happened at Lincoln Middle School touched communities across the country. Mrs. Reynolds herself had moved away shortly after losing her license, but her legacy remained, not as a cautionary tale of discrimination, but as a catalyst for change. As Principal Davis often said, sometimes it takes seeing the worst in our system to bring out the best in our community. 1 year to the day after Marcus first stood up to Mrs. Reynolds, he found himself back in room 203 after school. The classroom looked different now, the walls covered with student artwork and essays celebrating diverse voices and perspectives. Ms. Garcia was hosting a workshop for teachers from other schools, sharing Lincoln's journey of transformation. It started with one student, she told the visiting teachers, nodding toward Marcus, who was helping set up chairs. But it succeeded because an entire community finally chose to listen, to learn, and to change. As Marcus headed home that afternoon, he passed the school's new mural, a collaborative project designed by students. At its center was a simple quote: "Courage isn't about being fearless. It's about doing what's right, even when you're afraid." The story of room 203 could have ended with Mrs. Reynolds' departure, but instead, it became a beginning. A beginning of honest conversations about bias and privilege. A beginning of real institutional change. A beginning of students and teachers learning to be not just educators and learners, but advocates for justice. Marcus still kept his notebook, not to document wrongs anymore, but to record the positive changes he saw each day. Small moments of kindness, instances of inclusion, examples of understanding. Because sometimes the most powerful form of karma isn't just about consequences, it's about transformation. As the sun set over Lincoln Middle School that evening, casting long shadows across the playground where new friendships were forged and old barriers were broken, Marcus smiled. The invisible boy from the back of room 203 had found his voice, and in doing so, had helped others find theirs too. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all. that change doesn't always come from the top down, that sometimes it takes one person willing to stand up and speak their truth to remind us all of our own capacity for courage. Because in the end, karma isn't just about getting what you deserve, it's about creating the change you wish to see in the world. The legacy of Room 203 lives on, not just in the halls of Lincoln Middle School, but in every student who learns to stand up, every teacher who chooses to listen, and every person who decides that staying silent in the face of injustice is no longer an option. And that's a lesson worth learning, again and again.